I'm going to make some minor further observations, sort of surveying some of the things that I've gone over in recent recordings. So, I think it's prescient to point out how the little example that I went into with the kind of the battered woman who is effectively conditioning their partner to have a kind of histrionic um, interchange with her and has sort of conditioned him to be responsive or to sort of to that the codependence in their subconscious collusion is managed from his side from a kind of histrionic role that he's playing to be the consort of her. And then because she has essentially tried to break that mold after casting it on him, he then sort of precipitates abuse, therefore, to kind of um, sort of to compensate for that derangement that then he's experiencing a suffering that he was essentially deluded into comporting himself a certain way, to comporting his subconscious a certain way, and then he's having this woman who has ushered him into doing so, pulling the rug out from under his feet. And it's interesting that as a codependence in some sense together, they fulfill the whole picture of what the borderline is doing in terms of their overarching behavior and structure. In some sense, this is the fatalism that the borderline is is projecting onto their surroundings constantly, and they're just trying to find somebody else essentially to take the blame, to become the bad guy, to become the the dark protagonist in some sense, so that she can sort of be covered by that greater narrative, by that greater story, and then she can get away with her private, let's say, envy filtration, um, that keeps secluded her private. So the privacy of her internal greed and internal is managed by that envy that is stopping the external chaos, as it were, reaching that internal sanctum, and so she can continue to sort of stage new subterfuge and new manipulation and new, that is kept sacrosanct by the kind of external projection of the chaos of her overarching sort of behavior in some sense. So it's ironic that either way, the man is abusive or whatever, is just essentially another facet of her internal psychological structure in some sense. And when she has someone playing that role, then it just continues to insulate that internal greed in terms of the inner child, in terms of the greed over the belief structure that she has made herself an unsafe, because a victim is pure, is the sacred victim, essentially is then assured by that sort of by this mechanism. And anyway, I went into that depiction, and it's just interesting because essentially you can see that that's what's happening on a grand scale in terms of politics. That's what's happening with identity politics. Is the exact same thing as is occurring. Is that there is the narrative of this oppression, this force of oppression, but secretly what's happening is that there's this whole private, corrupt internal economy going on, um, in terms of the person who's essentially projecting this narrative and making it true, and make so it's sort of the story is being cast as a general sort of subterfuge, but also the envy filter that I think I described quite well in the last recording. There was a thing that I wanted to add about the envy filter, which is essentially the one-way filter between um, the borderline's irresponsible curation of their own belief structure, and essentially that allows them to filter the one way expectations from those beliefs, and put them into the subconscious emotional host that they have codependently associated themselves with. And then they can use that envy filter to sort of rebuff any kind of counter flow going the other way. Like, so there's no criticism that goes the other way. the criticism only goes one way. Let me just see if I made a note about this. Yeah, so it's interesting that this envy filter, in some sense, creates conventions. It creates an orthodoxy. It creates a dogma. It usually creates a kind of esoteric. It's because it's a fudged system. It's so this envy filter has to be locked. It has to be engaged or utilized a certain way. And just because some people utilize it, right, they, by definition, almost they create stereotypes. They leverage stereotype thinking, or they leverage heuristics or generalizations. They create a kind of simplification in order to get away with the envy filter, because essentially the envy filter is fundamentally also incapable of being direct about itself. It has to disguise itself. It has to make itself. It has to make itself proper or true in some greater sense. It has to be covered up by some sacred cow, by some overarching ethical, sort of fudge or story or something like that. And so that envy filter by itself is the thing that causes the toxification of a culture, the toxification and disordered, escalating dysfunction of the degradation of universal principles and rules. This is how the rule of law becomes undermined fundamentally. Is that envy filter, for it to make space for itself in culture in general, uh, um, has to essentially completely erode the moral fabric and inject this kind of general subterfuge and moral corruption. And also, therefore, it's useful for everyone. Many people can tap into it sympathetically. Like, we're part of the people that are on the right side of history. That's how it's kind of tapped into. That essentially you don't have to, it doesn't have to pertain to you for you to leverage it in some generalized sense. This is the idea of being an ally, essentially. This is the same way that, like, the Democrats in American politics were deeply sympathetic for for Hitler. They love that kind of politics. That's the kind of politics of the Democratic Party: infantilism, paternalism, authoritarian elite. Sort of they can just give this kind of virtue signaling. Oh, we're sorting it out for you. Just rely on us. We've got your interests at heart. We're catering to your identity. We're catering to the poor. It's always this lofty, sort of, the other people don't care about the poor, but we care about the poor. That's why we're so good at keeping people poor, essentially, because we've got a way to sort of rig the system where, we look like that we're attending to the problem, but we're actually facilitating all these other things that can happen because of that disorientation of the entire system for this sort of specialized and particularized goal, which is essentially, in the logic of the envy, it will always create a kind of a way to align yourself rationally in a superficial way, which will go undetectable because it's founded on a kind of intrinsic um, uh, uh, suppression of the idea of responsibility and accountability, that has sort of thrown it into a narrative, to recast it as a narrative. Okay, that was a bit bulky going through that, but anyway, I just wanted to basically point out that it's weird that, for example, how people who have been so corrupt and stolen so much public money, for instance, can essentially pretend to be on the side of the poor just because of some superficial thing like the color of their skin. And because they can say, no, because we share the color of our skin, we are the ones who are looking out for you. It's that kind of heuristic. It's that is facilitated essentially by this moral corruption and this envy filter. So as soon as you've got that kind of as soon as you've got that kind of thing normalized, as soon as culture itself doesn't automatically suppress that kind of distorted and toxic way of thinking, then obviously it grows like a cancer, it grows like a virus. And that's exactly what we have in most of the politics and cultures. And we don't have enough people willing to confront it. we don't have enough people willing to sort of actually tackle it head on, and there's this, I try to go into the elements of cowardice, and how people sort of make peace with it in principle, that they sort of, they don't find a way to at least dismantle the subterfuge, at least. Okay, anyway, was there anything else that I wanted to add? So it's very interesting how this kind of cultural dishonesty is a manifestation of, I mean, and it's interesting also how it proliferates like wildfire, because if one person can have this kind of envy matrix which they can get away with, which in some sense, this is why there was a traditional, I believe that this is why there was a traditional sexism, that sexism existed in the way that it did, with the stereotypes that it did in traditional society, because it was a way to keep the borderline um, sentiments and the borderline tactics, to keep it contained, to keep it suppressed. That was how it was being identified. That was how it was being contained. It was like, if you acted like that, they would be like, oh, you're being manipulative, just like a woman, So like, stop being so effeminate, and stop being manipulative like that. That would be the kind of the way to leverage the sexist stereotype to suppress the borderline thing in some sense. So, I mean, it didn't work in every case, let's just say, and certainly, any kind of heuristic can be outdone, you know, especially if it's inaccurate, and and if it's general, it sort of, it you get locked into the same kind of prison on a meta level, in some sense. Um, then in the name of sexism, you could leverage a kind of borderline thing anyway, But for the most part, in some vague sense, it probably did something, in the same way that Catholicism was essentially able to suppress the same, because you see the same thing crops up not just between the gender lines, but between the folklore and the specific history that particular people have, your tribalism essentially. I mean, I think the thing that made Western civilization great in some sense was not even the Enlightenment, although that's obviously sort of part of it, and it wasn't Christianity, although that's obviously also quite part of it. And I know that this is going to sound contradictory, but it was essentially Catholicism. It was just having a single narrative to crush the competing folklores and the competing, in some sense, having an overarching story that people weren't allowed to opt out of, that they weren't allowed to sort of create their own little subjective captivation, and then have their own little borderline fiefdom in some sense, and have their own little subculture. Obviously, still were people that did stuff like that, but in general, having Catholicism for 1,000 years sort of ground against that, and in some sense, and they branded it a kind of heresy in some sense, that obviously it could exist. You could have culturally specific, kind of sentiments and things like that, but if they grew too elaborated, if they grew too decadent, if they grew too self-indulgent in this kind of borderline thing, in which they encroached on the Catholicism, sort of container, which was this kind of overarching imposition in some sense, then they would become in and be swept out or whatever. And obviously, Catholicism itself surely has aspects of it which have this borderline um, capture built into it in some sense. But at least it was the same one. It was the same one, and it was consistent and persistent. And in its consistency, in the maintenance of it, in some sense, in the crushing maintenance of it, it 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 destroyed the other ones. It crowded out the other ones. So at least there was only one. There was only one deception, as opposed to many, many deceptions. And yes, that deception, had horrible, stupid things involved in it in some sense. But you understand, you're dealing with psychology here. It's messy. I mean, I've tried to give the history of the psyche in some sense. You have to realize that people orientated their psychology around the divinity of the sovereign, that the king was God's light on earth, shining forth God's rule. And so everyone lived in the same nation. Therefore they lived in the same psychological space. They didn't have to worry about it. They didn't have the kind of nomadism that we have now, that we've sort of moved on from that culturally. But now we have to really understand what we had going, what we had been granted automatically. We have to find a way to reason towards that now. We have to actually invent culture with a capital C, as it were, to supplement for the loss of Catholicism. And we have to piece back what we had in some sense, and we have to justify it, and we have to ground it in proper philosophy, as it were, in secular justifiable philosophy. And essentially, the psychological clarity that was precipitated by Catholicism, in some sense, or which was at least preferable to what happened, at least in some other different cultural um, forms of development. So the kind of the subjective tribalism, which is essentially touted and promoted by this borderline infused ideology, identity politics, as as an oversimplified way to solve the world's problems and to sort of destroy all the complexity in life, and just to sort of turn it into a disgusting racialist narrative. Um, that that we have to look back in history even with a huge amount of gratitude, and we have to understand what was actually going on, and we have to empathize, and we have to empathize with the human condition and the plight of the human condition, and we have to actually have something that doesn't just sell the soul of the human being to demagoguery and fucking totalitarian bullshit and more border. Are we really going to fall into the depravity of essentially the dark ages of the Nazi regime, which is culturally essentially where we are right now? Um, we're in the grip of it. Hopefully, we're going to get the One Ring and put it into the volcano in Mordor or whatever. But hopefully it's darkest before the dawn. But anyway, okay. Do I have anything else to add? Because it's interesting that two things were happening. Well, the ring was going into the volcano, and at the same time there was also armies fighting. It's interesting. That the one is a kind of philosophical metaphor, and the other one is on some level a ground war. It does require certain, and it's interesting because that ground war on some level can only really be mounted by dissemination of education and actually reaching the general population on some level. But we've got such corrupted institutions now. I don't think it's possible to really put the fascist genie back in the bottle. And even if it can be defeated philosophically, uh, they do such a good job at escalating and doubling down and making things worse. And even if philosophically we get on the right page, they might have already depleted and sabotaged so thoroughly that it's sort of beyond. There's a point at which it doesn't matter if you get the right person in charge of which is the one with the death squads, Colombia. Uh, because there's so much public debt that it doesn't really matter at that point, because essentially I mean, in some sense, to tell you the truth, I mean, I feel very unsympathetic when people put people in charge and they give them political power, and then the population is not willing to live with the consequences of their own uh, uh, misadventure. Um, and obviously, it would be nice if you could actually find and prosecute the corrupt. And I would say that the reason why that doesn't happen is because, again, it's so easy to just double down on the general deception, on the general corruption, the moral corruption just stays there. I mean, Jacob Zuma is still somehow in public life, and it's ironic because, he is also leveraging the same moral corruption that the EFF are leveraging. So they're both competing essentially on the same poison chalice to feed to the nation. But anyway, okay, I don't think I'm saying anything new, so I might as well stop. Yeah, the reason why, when I touched on Christianity and the Catholicism sort of issue, why I can't say Christianity was such a positive force for the, for Western civilization in some senses, because it was corrupted quite badly by Catholicism. That there are things in it that are positive, but that doctrine essentially I don't think ever became the mainstay of Catholicism in some sense. Catholicism was always a kind of bastardized version of Christianity. Um, but I mean, perhaps superficially it has some aspects, but it's more. It's exactly what I said. It's not the fact that Christianity suppressed the proliferation of borderline values and manipulation and envy filtering, but at least it was part of a canonical story, um, of an overriding narrative that drowned out all the competitors, and it was good at being consistent and being the same one. So it was part of the 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 general displacement of all others in some sense, and that sort of quieted the seas. It didn't resolve the issue of the tumultuous aspect that the sea is just a flabby mass of saline, you know, water that you can't drink, and if you do anything to it, it just sort of creates turbulence in equal and opposite direction. It sort of everything cancels itself out. It just, the troughs and crests. It just transmits force from it doesn't have a real character of its own, but at least it quieted the seas, as it were. Um, and then it also made people, in the quietness of that, it gave people the open, the calmness of thought to ponder what disturbs the seas. And although they couldn't necessarily turn that so much onto the Catholicism orthodoxy itself, they could at least use that calmness to identify the types and stripes of pathological, sort of things. I mean, that's not to say that Western Europe is not prone to, or Western civilization is not prone to bitter conflict and warfare and ideological, you know, subversion and subterfuge, and that it doesn't have. But in some sense, it has done better than other cultures at suppressing borderline pollution, as it were, and proliferation and keeping a hold on it. Although those mechanisms have now, I think, although culturally they still exist in some form, um, there's obviously a great effort to breed them out of existence, essentially, to indoctrinate the next generation and to stop them from establishing enough sanity and clarity of thought to think that there's even an alternative to the borderline fascistic way of conceiving of society and such. Anyway, damn, I wanted to say something completely different. I just wanted to touch on that and then move on. The other topic that I wanted to bring up was okay. Now I just remember I wanted to describe narcissism, uh, kind of with reference to what I've said about histrionic and borderline, because I've gone into it, I think, quite detailed in a quite nicely sort of detailed way. I wanted to give narcissism a sort of similar treatment in relation to the things that I spoke about the other disorders. But I just want to finish that idea now about Christianity, though, because I mean it is slightly more complicated than that. Because obviously, Christianity being a kind of personal faith as well, not just being a social imposition that Catholicism was imposing on society, but also had an interpersonal dimension. Again, even though I wouldn't consider that the actual Christian doctrine, that it was still a perversion in some sense, it still served as part of that function, as I was describing, that at least it was displacing the personal borderline. So it wasn't just that it stopped borderlines from infecting uh, the political economy, as it were, or the cultural social consciousness, but it also impeded individuals from certain forms of extravagant um, extensions of their borderline values in some sense. In that, well, not entirely, I would say, but at least within certain excesses, people weren't able to sort of um, create their own, at least, religion. They couldn't create their own borderline subculture cult, as it were. They couldn't cross over the line into the religious terrain. So there were some, which is essentially what can be facilitated if you allow people to indulge into folklore. And I mean, you can see the explosion of Wicca and paganism. I'm not speaking out against anything like that. People have the liberal freedom to do that, but you just understand that, like, saying that people have the liberal freedom to do that, in some sense, that requires a kind of liberal structure and a sort of liberal political consciousness. And if everyone goes into that kind of stuff, then if they really give themselves over to it and they don't sort of it's that kind of belief system is quite commensurate with developing, it's kind of a kind of toxic perennialism that says, well, now it's actually time for us to become an authoritarian, political culture, and everything should be in the image of this, um, that the liberal structure, in some sense, at least archetypally, to some degree, was in a primordial form in terms of Catholicism, merely by the fact that it was displacing that which would make it impossible to have a liberal sort of environment, which I guess obviously didn't even it took European society thousands of years, or throughout the course of 1,000 years, to sort of develop into that. Even it's not like Catholicism made that obvious from the start. It grew from the silence that Catholicism imposed, as it were, on the quiet and calm that it imposed. Okay, this is a complicated sort of cultural psychosocial thing. I've treated it in more detail in other recordings. So let me just move on to narcissism. So I'm starting to sort of speculate with a certain idea that, in some sense, narcissism has something like a pure narcissist has something that is similar enough to the envy filter, but it's nothing like the envy filter. And in some sense, it exists purely within the inner child itself. It exists within the narcissist's unconscious side of the mind, which obviously for it is not unconscious. And so the narcissist is actually a curator of their own beliefs, but they also hold their own beliefs, I think, at some distance, because they can sort of toy with them within some parameters, within some subsets of their belief. They can create fictions to themselves, and that's fine because they've got only one set of sacrosanct beliefs, which are like their solipsistic constitution. And in some sense, I believe that they construct within their inner child a kind of inverse subconscious, where it's like it does the same thing that a subconscious would do for other people, but they do it within a kind of contemplative emulation from a set of beliefs that they're fine toy that they're okay to toy with and revise and edit and be fast and loose with, or can articulate. And so they can almost do some things that are similar in terms of in the way that the envy filter of a borderline can create a kind of sympathetic cultural web, uh, um, or a web of cultural, sympathetic intellectual sympathizing, can create a web of intellectual sympathizing that conforms to the rudiment of using that envy filter, um, as the conduit between their inner child and the subconscious of others. Um, a narcissist will have a kind of internal playground, an internal sandbox, where they are building structures which, they can toy with them to some degree, but they've maybe got some snapshots in there about which contemplative sandbox iterations are stable and sort of have a kind of consistency. And in some sense, it's almost like the inverse of the envy filter, because it's not they're not connecting with something on the outside. They are only tracking things that have been monitored and modeled in terms of their belief, and they are the king of their own, of curating their own beliefs in some sense. And in some sense, the only way that you can harm a narcissist, and in some indirect sense, narcissists are more vulnerable in this sense, because borderlines can compartmentalize between the external and the internal, and then they can keep their internal bullshit insulated. Whereas a narcissist, in some sense, if you are in a narcissist's inverted, if you're being plotted within a narcissist's inverted subconscious, as it were, uh, you can potentially get your hands on objects, on mental objects that the narcissist is tracking and monitoring within their conception of things, and you can essentially move those objects around and essentially cause the narcissist a kind of internal dissonance in terms of their beliefs, in terms of the sandbox. You can sort of use the sandbox, you can reorientate the sandbox because they have some vision on you. And if you can track how they have vision on you, and if you can sort of reverse engineer the kind of emulation, the kind of matrix that they are conjuring in their inverted subconscious, in their unconscious sandbox, or the inner child sandbox, then you can signal to them greater metaphysical truths, as it were, by um, by playing with their toys and doing things with their toys, with their sandbox, that they didn't think were possible, that sort of break their mold in some sense, that break the construct of the sandbox itself, and that reach from the sandbox deeper into the other parts of the belief structures of the narcissist. As I say, I think that they have a kind of sacrosanct constitution which gives them the power, essentially, to gives them, well, it's double edged in some sense. It gives them the power to create this inverted subconscious, and also at the same time to essentially stop them from ever relating to something that's actually subconscious, that sort of is a kind of like an autistic um, seal that contains their seat of consciousness from ever venturing beyond the inner child. And there's at least some level of self-deception around that. There's some level of internal belief, justification, and necessitating and sympathizing. Um, and obviously, these sandboxes are so engaging themselves that they have all the complexities that other people have, but they have them from the perspective of the architect. They are always the architect of the scenario, and therefore, obviously, it can be difficult for them, because if they are getting too dislocated from their ability to handle the control of the sandbox, then they will want to sort of destroy all the structures and make new ones or something like that, and they'll confabulate, and they will sort of try to teleport themselves to a new sandbox, um, so that they can almost do a lot of things like pushing the reset button, but in a completely sort of different form, and it takes on a different sort of character, because they're not doing this with crying. They're doing this just usually with raw anger and shouting and sort of narcissistic rage. And but I mean, I guess they can also create, quite usually one-dimensional and stupid justifications of their actions, or excusing themselves, and usually it's like, they will just kind of make a narrative. So there are parallels with that and borderline, but I believe that it's happening all contained within the inner child. They essentially don't have a real subconscious. Some way that's almost a metaphorical construct that you can try to understand their internal mechanics. Okay, so I probably almost suggested that I was going to give more treatment to it than that. In some sense, the narcissist is cursed because they are fundamentally a simpler creature with less moving parts, but they are trying to mimic the same kind of sophistication to some degree as the borderline, but they have less material to work with. And that simplicity in terms of the medium that they have to work with also makes it more sophisticated in terms of their self-inception, in terms of their own belief structure. So there's a kind of cognitive dissonance which is running on overtime, which borderlines, in some sense, although borderlines have dissonance, it's one big self-deception, whereas with the narcissist is much more convoluted. I wanted to make another point as well, which I wanted to add on to the last recording, which I was actually didn't remember properly to bring up, which was now slipping my mind again. Something about the medium of dishonesty. What was it? Damn it! No, okay, it slipped my mind. Uh, Let me just describe that one aspect better than I just did, I guess, is that when I said that the borderline has got one big self-deception, that's like sort of when they are transferring the greed into the envy filter, which then they kind of, they can have a kind of moral certainty, because that envy filter in some sense is like the moral cloud that they're imposing on their victim or their host, or their codependent, sort of structure that they're trying to house that envy filter in some sense, um, which is this kind of systemic deception that needs to be protected and concealed, and secured and made safe, because everyone is actually like that or something like that. That's the kind of justification. Um, yeah, so in some sense it's weird. The borderline is kind of like a half-life narcissist that they kind of have both things going. They have a belief structure in a child that gives them the permission to create this envy filter, and in some sense, because I mean, this the obviously the borderline doesn't have their own subconscious. They are just looking for someone else to have a subconscious that they can control a certain way that can correspond to how they like to um, interchange their envy filter into reactions, into consequences, which they can direct, with somebody else being accountable for how those consequences are delivered, essentially, uh, which in some sense is kind of what a narcissist is doing in some vague sense, but the narcissist in some sense actually has to care about the nitty gritty, actually has to care about the internal mechanics of all the beliefs in some sense. And so narcissists in some sense know that they're not the same as other people, but they also know that, well, they believe that they are superior because essentially they're the only things. They are actual solipsists. They believe that they are the only mind in the universe that can think on that level, that can see beneath the coding of the emotional matrix or something like that. And they never enter the matrix because that's for the deluded, that's for the deranged, and essentially they are the only architect. They are the sole architect, as it were. Um, in some sense, a borderline is a narcissist that actually isn't a solipsist. They don't actually believe that they are the only mind. They just believe that they deserve to enslave all other minds. So they're kind of like they believe that there should be a one-way transaction, a one-way filter between them and other minds, and that they should have a kind of subjective domain. So they like in some sense they are narcissists, as well as having this way of treating other people. They have a patterned culture of treating other people's subconsciouses a certain way, and then histrionics are exactly the same as that. Just they become unconscious about it. In some sense, a histrionic is a borderline that grew up a bit too much, and then they actually developed their ego function to some extent, and because they developed their ego function to some degree, that created a kind of unconscious borderline, uh, uh, a suppressed and unconscious borderline starting point. That's a bit of a metaphor, but yeah. They sort of they grew up too much, um, and they gave too much. They gave actual relevance to the subconscious domain, and they worked out that essentially they could extend their control better being a participant, because essentially, I guess maybe, I mean, look, there could be many different reasons why the kind of the borderline kernel became histrionic, but in some sense it's because the idea was is that you can feed your internal greed by actually playing the game and risking, and actually joining the game and risking losing. The borderline is like playing a game that they have no risk of losing, and the histrionic has actually just said that, okay, actually I don't mind playing to win and risking that I can be a loser. So they actually give themselves over to the kind of the cultural mass, the collective cultural, zeitgeist or whatever. They'll like, yes, I'll let that be the arbiter. They let somebody else be the judge of it, whereas the borderline keeps the judge in the inner child in some sense, whereas the histrionic actually allows some kind of strange fudged ego judgment of like, okay, well, popularity will be something like high status popularity or high expert popularity or expert credentials or authority. It's they'll have some they'll create some god figure out of some kind of rationality, or something, they'll elect a an epistemic conducive uh, um, uh, sort of idolatry that they can then center and ground themselves to orient. So essentially, they become stable. They become stably codependent with an idolatry that is plugged into reality, some facet of external reality, and so they use that to export the seat of consciousness from their inner child, and then their inner child obviously then becomes unconscious because of that export. Whereas the narcissist doesn't do any of this stuff. In some sense, they have a weird kind of simulated subconscious within their own belief, but strewn and framed by the tenets of their own belief structure or whatever, within some subset of their beliefs, of things that it's okay to toy with and experiment with, and to sort of create models of prediction and to pervade over. And in some sense, it's arbitrary what models they create and what models they want to to use to verify their overarching um, mastery and confirmation of their insulation. Because in some sense, the only thing that they have to keep on reaffirming is whatever part of their belief involves their self-image disowning the external subconscious, or disowning their own emotions, because that's the same thing. The one is the model of the other. So sort of relegating emotions as to only attaching to the internally modeled sandboxes in some sense. So it's sort of like the captivation of the inverse subconscious, which is a belief machine as a subset within the constitution of the narcissist's inner child. Okay, so I'm being very vague in some sense, that I'm not outlining exactly what what the example of the kind of the ontology would be exactly. My metagram system would probably give some clues. Or perhaps metatype rather, actually, to or metagram and metatype together would probably might be able to give some better, clearer outline of reverse engineering. It's interesting. I wonder, since what I've said before about metagram, if I mean, it's probably true that certain metagram types will manifest concretely as particular particular sets of disorders, that it'll either be a combination of certain comorbidities, or it'll be a certain spectrum within a certain preset sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, yeah, that would, I need to start diagnosing people in terms of, or I can't say that word legally, but I need to start um, typing people and then asking them, or and then I guess getting what their diagnosis is in terms of personality disorder, and seeing if there's a consistency between that. Because that at least, because then I would be able to probably get very close to reverse engineering, or even just creating very useful archetypes in terms of my metagram typology, in terms of like what that circuit is emblematic of on the ontological aspect of the development of that particular false ego. Okay, anyway, and essentially how that circuit of that metagram structure is symbolic of a particular kind of decision that was made, that that inculcated a self-image, a self-portrait that manifested as that species of false ego. Um, anyway, that's about it, I guess. I think I've done this topic to death pretty much. It is interesting how a lot of these disorders are almost metaphors for the other ones in varying degrees of analysis and obviously turning them into symbolic constructs for the others. So it's never very precise, but it's interesting that in some sense the the narcissist is very self-satisfied, is very empowered in some, at least it has the potential to exude that and to enjoy that sense of himself or herself. And that kind of narcissistic power play is, although it has to be maintained by a kind of vigorous, convoluted calibration of these sandboxes and things like that, and getting into sort of a minutiae, of obsessiveness in some sense, which in some sense undermines that the simplicity of the narcissist in some sense. It's possible to trap the narcissist into a kind of to enforce him to sort of follow some kind of rationalistic formula in order to preserve his own structures to some degree, if he has already sort of decided that he wouldn't just sort of pack them in, and he can't find an easy way to kind of quickly collapse them and to sort of create a more weaselly or slimy or sort of convoluted way of continuing the kind of passing forward the buck in terms of avoiding the dissonance or the hurt of the dissonance or something like that. Um, and sometimes I guess, the narcissist also literally, after they have realized that their whole contemplative system is not the only one possible in some sense, that there's a part of development which they kind of skipped out on. This perhaps happens over a lot of experience, over a lot of time. They reach the understanding in some sense that that there is an aspect in psychological reality which they have completely, they have such limited access to, and they've completely missed out on. And then you can kind of get the kind of self-pitying narcissist that is getting that wants to mortify themselves so that they can at least try get glimpses of a kind of ego function, and they can almost they can try to recycle their whole inner child in some sense. And when I say recycle, I mean not as in the recycling bin. I mean like in the sense that the whole thing gets revivified, that the whole false ego complex um, re-stimulates itself, that the circuitry makes a full loop. It makes a full circle, um, and that gives them an aspect to kind of for a brief moment to try to sort of find at least it can be hoped that you can use that mechanic in some sense to import a new mystery machine that you can get inside of the inner child, because you're trying to steal something from the heavens, from the ego function, and try to get it to sort of work the magic in the super ego and precipitate a new object to be delivered to you in your sandbox as a narcissist. Um, anyway, I sort of covered that in earlier recordings, like earlier recordings, like 15 hours ago in my recordings. I think that came up in sort of in one of the volumes, one of the 4 volumes. The volumes actually called Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3, Volume 4. Anyway, the thing that I want to get into is what I would call the patrician aspect of the borderline. The prestige, obviously the when I say patrician, I mean like how they see themselves as high status, high class, aristocracy in some sense. They need to be powerful. I mean, they also need to be powerful for practical reasons, because otherwise they can't secure their dishonesty and their fraud, as it were. Um, they can't easily conceal it without the unaccountability that power generally confers, um, or the scope, or some scope of unaccountability for them to sort of work their subterfuge with. So the thing that I'm trying to get into is essentially how that envy filter essentially creates an interesting kind of narrative that, you see, the way to justify having an envy filter requires a kind of religious worldview in some sense, or an esoteric spiritualism or something like that, or some kind of fatalism, in which there is a kind of cosmic fate on some level, because unless you abrogate epistemic responsibility on that kind of level, unless you degrade agency, epistemic agency, or agency itself, self-determinism, on that kind of level, you can't really justify having an envy filter, because envy filters are essentially trying to use a contrasting heuristic to um, excuse your unilateral subjective imposition of boundaries, and the heuristic of the envy filter itself. So the envy filter is itself a fudge, okay, but you can only have fudge if there's somebody else who's willing to take on the role of essentially the grand fudge maker or something like that, which is, in some sense, has to be a kind of pseudo religious, kind of contemplative model of reality. And so when people who have the same ideology, okay, this is getting more complicated, because actually what I'm talking about is more like the hybridized borderline with the ideology in some sense, which they're more histrionic than borderline, but they do sort of have an understanding of the borderline thing in some sense. So, this is already a kind of, it's a very weird sort of thing, because, this is like the Nazis had this kind of culture essentially. Um, that, essentially, because, like, for example, if you're a Nazi, right, and you believe in blood and soil, and you believe in your genes and your group, because you have to, essentially, you have to. If you don't believe in your group, then you're letting your group down, right? That's the same bullshit in identity politics. And it's like, well, then what happens actually if your group dies out, or if you're the last one, and then you have to go join some other group, then, like, how good was your culture, how good was your ethnicity, like, in some sense, if you get really bad luck, you can't really just call it bad luck, because then like whatever it is that you're describing about the way of the world, it doesn't really support an ethos or an ethic. That then you can't have ethics. You can only have ethics if you say that, like, what happens to you deserves to happen to you. And that's why the envy becomes such a kind of competitive blood sport in some sense, that, like, if you can see some contrasting disparity, you can leverage that into a hysterical claim and expectation and sense of entitlement. So because of this idea is that, like, essentially the whole system is rigged, and therefore you need to get in on the rigged system. And in fact, the people who accept that the system is rigged in this particular way, in whatever way, in the way of identity politics, in terms of how identity uh, should administer what goes on. Um, then what happens to people that essentially have the same mode of interacting with reality, but, like, sort of, they just don't get the good outcome. Like, it just doesn't, uh, they don't get what they want, or they don't get to, they haven't they haven't won in terms of the manipulation in some sense. Like, they just weren't lucky enough. They just weren't in the right place at the right time. and in some sense everyone is interchangeable in that sense, and they're all sort of drifting along based on some kind of destiny heuristic, So this is, they really focus in on something like destiny, that all you can do is have the same way of interpreting reality and then run off of some kind of supra. I'm not describing this well. Anyway, there is anyway. I mean, what I'm describing is very technical and it's not that useful, but it is a structure that manifests. It is a facet of one of the presentations in some sense, but it's more of a cultural phenomenon than it is from the structure itself. So I guess, I'm not even just, there's not that much interesting structure to define. What's more interesting is the social manifestation of it, which is essentially this kind of patrician pecking order, this kind of status, and so, and it's interesting because like some people have more power in this corrupted secondary intellectual economy. Just essentially they have the, in fact, if you don't know that you have power based on this hierarchy or based on this system, you have the most power. That's also how power works in general, but anyway, that if you don't know that you have it, then you have so much of it, and so this happens in terms of, well, if you're so disadvantaged and if you're so systematically oppressed because of your intersectional ranking, and you're so oppressed that you don't even know that you're oppressed because of the systemic oppression, then it's like, in fact, you have so much power that like your opinion doesn't matter, because it's like you haven't even injected yourself into the middling, sort of pecking order. You have so much power relative to how the pecking order is calibrated that you can't even be incorporated into the pecking order. So it's weird that like the pecking order really exists for, what has generally been tagged as the white liberals or something like that. But I mean, they are soon not to be outdone, I believe, by the overt fascistic calcification of this form of morality in some sense. Where, I mean, already you can see these things being generated within the culture, within the current contemporary political maneuvering, that it's sort of, it's almost testing how much derangement it can get away with, how much disorientation, how much destabilization and compartmentalization of other people's feelings that they can get away with. That essentially, there's going to be like, well, to prove that you're not racist, you have to be completely fine with, throwing your children to some, like sacrifice machine to prove that, that all lives have equal value, and so the systemic oppression must be atoned for in some kind of hostage taking process or something like that. That it's actually going to be implemented. Um, I mean, essentially, what that, I mean, obviously that wouldn't happen in practice, but I mean, that's a bit of a metaphor. In some sense, it's going to be like, well, everyone will, in the same way that people tolerated Hitler taking over Poland, or a lot of people tolerated Hitler taking over Austria. Essentially, I really think that culturally in the world, uh, it would be hard for people not to speak out against a genocide in South Africa. I think almost they might get away with it, or at least it would just be labeled as an internal affair. In the same way that like Hitler was left to his own devices, in terms of the genocide against the Jews. this is kind of a slightly different topic, I guess, but although somewhat interrelated slightly. Yeah, so it is hard to define the kind of the brittleness in this pecking hierarchy, um, in this pecking order. Uh, and in some sense, that's the kind of pecking order that women, to a large extent, have conditioned themselves to gaming because it's safer, it's easier. You know, it's much easier to work out that society deserves that you will be approached by handsome rich men that want to give you nice things, as long as that you are sort of dominant over the other woman in terms of your status or your social status, or something like that. You know, it's kind of like it's on that kind of and I'm being very vague. Yeah, I've actually, this whole topic is actually a bit embarrassing. Um, but you can kind of see the outline of the kind of thing that I'm talking about. There's a kind of cosmic fatalism that fills in the gaps of the moral spaces where the whole thing, because it's not very well reasoned at its core, just sort of fills in, is the glue that fixes the edifice. And it's interesting because there is that level of kind of arbitrary and vicious, I don't know, what did they call it? Like ideological cannibalism, when they're actually infighting amongst themselves. And in some sense, there's a level to which that can never be solved. Because let's just say the fascists took over. Let's just say Hitler took over the whole world and genocided every other country, and the only thing left were the Aryans. Well, then there's no other group in existence. So, like, what's the difference between like someone who does very well and someone who doesn't do very well? Like, if they're both Aryans, if they both come from the same identity class, you know, how do you sort of calibrate that? And in some sense, then they have to sort of, how do you keep the general theory alive and sort of account for normal things in some sense? And then they have this weird kind of internal status, and they have no way to actually vent that towards a scapegoat if they if there aren't any left. I mean, well, I guess this, well, the clue is that they never do run out of scapegoats. They always invent more conspiracies. I mean, even when the Germans had captured all of the Jews and removed them physically from society, they were still complaining that the Jewish conspiracy lingered in the minds, in the same way that these racists complain about the colonization of the mind and the white thinking, that they just brand ideas that disrupt their unaccountable power as being themselves the product of racism and racism incarnate. And then how, you know, you see, this is why I think that if you just left them to their own devices, obviously you can't do this politically, but if you just gave them a country and said, okay, you actually try to run a country based on your disgusting corrupt morality, it would it would have to go to war with the world. It would have to find an enemy. It would have to find an opponent, even to keep itself alive and functioning to some degree. Because if they're stuck with this internal quandary, this internal sort of, how does status get apportioned within our own system, they have to have a very vague spiritual kind of cosmic justice, which in some sense is just not good enough. It's it's laughably thin and facile. And in that sense, it's as facile as the kind of dissonance that gets projected by narcissists. To me, it's almost like a mirror of the same, a reflection of the same kind of metaphysical issue that's obviously being expressed differently. Um, in some sense, borderlines would have an easier way of doing this, although borderlines are just so dysfunctional in terms of just their outward engagement in reality itself, in some sense, because it's just so corrosive and unsustainable on a structural level. But in some sense, borderlines would just conflate this more into the envy. It would just become another layer of a kind of the envy filter that they use, in some sense. That because in some sense, borderlines don't share their borderline with anyone else. They are their own identity. They are a an individual identity, which is also why I think that a lot of pure borderlines can't become identity politics people. I actually think that they are hybrid. I think that all these borderline cases that are being diagnosed in some sense. I mean, look. I'll say that there's something to the diagnosis, obviously, because they're not just histrionics, but they're actually ideological hybrid borderline histrionic cases. That the ideology itself has pierced the veil between politics and psychology. And okay, so that's, I think I've covered everything now. Yeah.